This video is sponsored by Wing Technology, your ultimate flight sim hardware solution.
Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing wonderfully well. Another interview. We are really belting through these interviews. And I've got to say hello today to Shady. Hello Shady.
Hello.
Thank you very much for coming on. So, we've got RAF Hawk and Tornado Sooty. I joined up in 1990 and after my mechanics course was posted to RAF Valley on Hawks. I then spent 4 months in the Falklands on 1435 flight Tornado F3s before being posted to Germany. I worked in the engine bay at RAF Brugge for 2 years on the RB 199 before a posting to RAF Coningsby on the F3s again. In 1996 to 1997, I did my technician course at Cosford. After there, I moved to RAF St Athan. Where's St Athan?
Just near Cardiff. Not far from Cardiff.
Okay. I worked on storage flights, looking after Hawks, Sea Harriers, Tucanos, Jaguars and Tornadoes, all of my favourite aeroplanes in one. Beautiful. We also did a major servicing on Spitfire from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Cool. In 1999, I moved back to Germany on 14 Squadron Tornadoes. Plenty of detachments to Kuwait, policing the Iraqi Southern No-Fly Zone. Awesome. We had trips to Red Flag in Las Vegas. Awesome. Green Flag in Utah. Awesome. And too many trips to Goose Bay in Canada. In 2001, RAF Germany closed and the squadron moved to RAF Lozimuth, and I can never say that right. I moved across to 12 Squadron on the usual Kuwait and Goose Bay trips. In 2003, we were part of Gulf War II, flying from Doha. I moved to Cosford as an instructor later, and that year spending lots of time teaching UAE students and teaching airframes engineers about engines. I stayed there until 2005 when I changed trades to something completely different. What did you change trades to?
Bizarrely, I went to university to become a nurse.
Isn't that funny? That's not actually the amount of times I've seen people do the job and it's a great job and whatever, and later in life they become nurses. And the reason I know that is because I've spent a lot of time in hospitals in the last few years, and you just get talking with the nurse, and it's sometimes just a calling in life that they have to do, which I found really interesting. Is that what you're working as now?
Yeah. So, I mean, weirdly, it was, when you get bored in a job and
Sure.
teaching the same sort of 6-week course over and over again. And there was an opportunity for interviews at Cranwell, and it was a 3-day interview. And I thought, 3 days off work. But I think probably because I wasn't that bothered about whether I got it or not, ended up with me getting it because I wasn't nervous. So I was sort of sold by them.
Roger. Okay, well, before we crack on with the valid viewers' questions, which we like to do, a couple of stories have immediately jumped to mind. The more people I interview, the more kind of crossovers I find. I've noticed you were on, obviously you're not flying, but you on ground crew duty, if that's the right word, in certain places when several of the guys in our group, they're actual tornado pilots, Tim Davies, Simon Pearson, Alistair, sorry I forgot his second name, but another. We've got three pilots now, and I bet you've crossed their paths at one point or another. Same bases, even the same squadron, and yeah, that must be really interesting. I get the more people we interview, I get the feeling, the more kind of cross paths we're going to have. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so even on the squadron, obviously you've got the air crew that are officers and the ground crew that are enlisted. But we operate generally out of different buildings or different parts of the same building. So weirdly, you know them in the short time that you're strapping them in and seeing them off and seeing them back. And perhaps just the odd chit chat and say hello. But very rarely is there any real mix in between us.
Roger. Very interesting. Okay, the other story I found really interesting. It was my birthday yesterday, and I had my parents come over, and we got talking about the tornado. And my dad, who worked at the time for Cambridge Consultants, which were specialists in modems, modulator, demodulators, and turns out from 1981 to 1989, him and his group designed and made all of the, let me try and get this right, analog to digital converter units in the Tornado F3 for their radar, in their radar bay. because that's what they specialise in. I didn't know any of this. It was really interesting. And the interesting thing was the Panavia, or whoever gave them the contract, specified that this unit that they were making couldn't give any EM emissions because it would wreck the radar. So they had to make this whole unit and build it into a solid alloy heatsink, which had never done before. It's really interesting. So one day I'm going to find a tornado avionics guy and find someone who actually knows about that panel. I know you're going to be engines. I just found that really. I only discovered that yesterday. It's a really interesting story. Right.
See if I can find one for you if you like.
Wow, that would be amazing. Well, maybe there's one about still, because obviously they're not being used anymore now. So.
No, a few, but I mean, avionics people were always called fairies.
That's good.
A lot of their panels used to be secured with something called a fairy fastener. So they were fairies.
Fairy fastener. Brilliant. I think they were pointy head. I'm slowly getting the terms pointy heads in the Americans, but very good. Right, Mr. Shady, are you ready for the valued viewers' questions?
On the way, I'll try my best.
As ever, these are literally real questions from real people. They might be stupid, they might be amazing, they might have terrible English. Just suck it up and we'll get through. So, 1. Which variant of the Tornado did you prefer to work on? The F3 or the GR variants?
Well, it's a difficult one to answer because I was differently qualified on each one. So the F3, primarily, I was a mechanic. So most of the things that I did concerning an F3 were mainly flight line duties. So before flight, turnaround servicings, after flight servicing, a little bit of rectification, but you're really heavily supervised when you're a mechanic. Tornado GR4s, then I was a technician, so you're the supervisor and you're doing a lot of things above and beyond. So I'd have to prompt for the GR4, mainly because I knew more about it, so it becomes more comfortable. And they tended to be flown a lot harder, so you had more interesting things go wrong with them. So I'd go for the GR4.
Roger, and sorry to be a massive noob, but I am at the end of the day. Were the engines different in the fighter and the ground war variants? And disclaimer, my Tornado books have just arrived for my birthday yesterday, but I haven't read them yet. But was there a difference in the engines?
Yeah. So the GR1, oh crikey, was it a 101? RB199 Mark 101. GR4s was the 103, and the F3s I think was the 104. I think the core engine was essentially the same. The jet pipe was longer, and the ECU was a DECU, so it was digital, whereas on the GR1 and 4 it was a MECU, so it was more analog.
Right. What I remember about, obviously you don't really see these planes now, but what I remember about seeing them was that they sounded really impressive. They were really loud, didn't put that much thrust out compared with maybe contemporary engines, but they were built around ruggedness and durability. Is that a thing that you saw in them, or is that just a load of rubbish?
No, absolutely. I mean, engine change wise, they were really quite easy to change for a start. You know, you could have them in and out very, very quickly if needed. They were also modular, so within an RB199 there was 16 modules if you include the gearbox underneath. So all of the modules were obviously rated on hours, so hours in service to be changed. But even then, you know, they lasted hundreds, if not thousands of hours. They were really, really, really good.
Roger, yeah, exactly what I've heard about them. An interesting thing about this engine, of course, is the massive reverse buckets. I remember they came like a clamshell around the back, didn't they? They're really impressive to give the reverse thrust.
Yeah. Air operated, so it'd be a tapping off the engine that went into something called a TRCU, so a thrust reverse control unit. Really quite small as well. I don't know if I sent you a picture of one of those.
The unit itself?
Yeah.
No.
I'll see if I can dig one out and send it over to you.
Thank you. I'm just I'm just perusing Google as we look. I'm just looking at a kind of close up of that mechanism now and the piping to it. Did the engine have a traditional, you know, kind of closable nozzle? It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, variable nozzle. Yeah, at the back. So I'm just watching your stream at the moment. So second row down on the left, you've obviously got the buckets deployed. It's hidden underneath. You can just see the edge of the thrust reverse control unit. So if you go sort of halfway along the picture, you'll see some tubing.
Mm-hmm.
A bit further left and lower down. Right a touch. So it's there. So just, and then on the opposite side, you'd have the nozzle control unit. Again, operated by air, tapping from the engine. And then if you can see the arms that control the buckets, you'll see some tubing that runs around the outside of the engine, just near where the fire seal is, so the black rubberized seal.
Yep.
And it was just a series of torsion bars that went into little gearboxes. So it went from the TRCU into the mechanism, and then it was just a mechanism that threw the buckets open.
Cool mechanism. Right, let's crack on, shall we? From question 1, I can't remember, are you a DCSer or not?
Yep.
If the plane became available in DCS, kind of a stupid question really, if it became available in DCS, would you buy it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think like anyone though, if you know it well, you'd be picking little holes in it, wouldn't you?
Well, isn't it interesting? Yeah, to me it would look fabulous. To you, it would look, that's in the wrong place, or that's slightly misshapen, but I guess that comes with the job, doesn't it? You know it, inside out, all the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, but I mean, conversely, very little about actually operating it. So, in the role that it's.
Roger. Okay. Right, next question. What were some standout ingenious design details that you can remember from the aircraft that you worked on? What an interesting question.
Yeah, I was racking my brains because I think when you work on things, you tend
it becomes normalised, I guess.
You get used to them and you don't see anything as novel anymore. It just becomes a pain, really. So I think something that was difficult to get your head around the operation of was probably the dashpot throttle that they use on the Adore engine, so the Hawk and the Jag. That was difficult to get your head around how that operated because it was hydromechanical. It was variable rotating swash plates. It worked off ambient pressure and temperature and fuel pressure, whether it was high pressure tapping or low. And basically all it did was it prevented overfueling on acceleration. So it metered the flow to match all those parameters and it prevented the surges. So really, really clever system. It was probably the last of the pure hydromechanical fuel systems, really.
So would that have been replaced by electric servos?
Well, the system within, I mean, a lot of the systems we tend to say are electronically operated now, but at the end of the day, you still need a metering sort of orifice or a throttle of some sort. So in the Tornado, it was a kinetic knife. But again, that was operated from electronic sensors sending voltages to a particular unit, and that would just alter the opening of the throttle.
Just got a cool picture here of the RB1199 with all its kind of guts on display. The core engine, really interesting. Very cool. Okay, let's punch on. How common was it for the RAF squadrons to have mascots in high-ranking positions? Did 14th Squadron really have a Burmese python as a squadron leader?
They did, yeah. And again, I think that was more of an aircrew hijinks thing that they tended to do. The ground crew tended to steer well clear of the bloody thing. So that was kept in the aircrew building. Its name was Eric. I know that it was definitely brought back to the UK when Bruggen was closed or when 14 came back. And I also remember at Waddington on the AWACS, they had a massive owl in a cage outside. I think it's less common now, just from a sort of
RSPCA point of view.
Yeah, exactly.
Keeping your massive python getting constantly scared by engines and stuff.
Yeah. So I couldn't say whether it's absolutely pandemic throughout all of the RAF, but yeah, definitely on 14.
No, I've never heard of that. It's the first time I've heard of that. It shows how little I know, really. Really interesting. Okay. 5. I once heard a story that after the Gulf War, number 1 I suppose, the RAF intended to send the most capable interceptors we had to take part in Operation Dural. These were supposed to be the Phantom F3s before they were retired, but at the last minute someone from the MOD pointed out that we had just sold the Saudis billions of pounds worth of Tornado F2s and suggested it would be slightly awkward if we sent Phantoms and not Tornadoes. Was this true, and did the early F2/F3 Tornadoes have a bad reputation to begin with?
I think this is bordering on. So it's an interesting story, isn't it? And I wish it was true. All I can tell you is my perspective of it. And I know in the early days it had a really bad rap, the F3 for the radar in particular. I think they very, very quickly sorted that out. And as soon as they had it, it was really quite a capable radar. I doubt very much whether going into a war that the MOD would give a flying hoot about what they sent out there from a political point of view. I think they probably just sent the most capable aircraft they had at the time. And if you think about the Phantom was really quite late in its serviceable life and was probably carrying lots of ADFs and limb log entries in it, it was probably less capable than people like to dream that it was, if you know.
We do have a kind of romantic view with a lot of the oldies, don't we? And then the actual guys keeping them flying are like, yeah, no, it wasn't like that.
And I'm sure if you ask a lot of pilots, you know, if you needed to spend 4 hours in one place, would you sooner be in a Phantom or a Tornado F3? And I think I can guess what they choose.
Absolutely, yeah. The same rings through to the new planes as well, Raptors and 5th Gen and stuff like that. Right, anyway, number 6. Were the reversed thrust buckets on the Tornado difficult to work on, and how effective were they? As the Tornado was never really considered to be a short takeoff and landing capable, it seems like unnecessary maintenance needed for another system that could go wrong.
I think we touched on it earlier that so they were always used on landing. How capable and how quickly they stopped tended to not be our problem because we were, 500 yards away in a hardened aircraft shelter. So it might be worth asking a couple of your friends who operated them. But I did have a flight in one, and part of that was he preloaded the thrust reverse before we landed, and it was mightily impressive how quickly it did stop. So I'm sure they wouldn't put them on there for no reason. I think there was always an issue with the brakes not being great on Tornadoes until they got below sort of 140 knots, I think, rings a bell. But working on them, ultra reliable, really quick and easy to change as well. And a lot of the time it was sort of the mushroom stops, which is as it closes and it latches, those were the only things that really caught, and nothing that a good whack with a hammer didn't. and it worked fine.
Roger. I didn't realise that you could pre-engage them before touchdown. So in other planes I've seen with similar systems, they would have a weight on wheel sensor. You could engage this in midair, is that right?
Yeah. So, you'd rock the throttles over to the left. I think the right-hand throttle was thrust reverse and the left-hand throttle, I think, might have been spoilers. I'm not too sure. You'd have to ask your mates on that. But we always tested them on the ground when we were doing engine runs, and they worked fine. But yeah, it would have been operated by weight on wheels.
Right, how interesting. Okay, fair enough. Right, question 7. Following on my previous question, as the reverse thrust buckets deflect jet blasts both up and down, did they ever cause problems by kicking up FOD into the engines?
Not on RAF airfields, no. Just because they're a bit like US airfields and a lot of our allies, absolutely obsessed with FOD, foreign object damage, so everywhere was spotless. I can't recall it ever really throwing anything down the intake. I mean, there were times when there was stuff that was loose at the side that would get moved a little bit. But on the buckets themselves inside, there were strakes on them. So all of these buckets were either left or right hand upper, right hand lower, etc. And on the inside of the bucket would be strakes that would direct the air sort of forward but outwards. So it was never directly under the jet or over the jet.
Roger. I did have a follow-up question and I forgot it because I'm stupid. So, oh yeah, I know. I was just going to say, don't go and land it in Russia. No. Question 8. Generally speaking, what was your favourite aircraft type to work on and why?
Well, I think if you worked on a flight line and it was a Friday, and your boss said, as soon as all the jets are serviced and back in the hangar, you can start drinking. Then probably the Hawk, just because nothing ever really went wrong on it. Familiarity always drags me back towards the GR4, because you know all its little foibles and how to fix it quickly. But the Harrier was always interesting as well, just because it was so odd. You know, it was just really odd.
Yeah, recently interviewed a Harrier Sooty, and that was a really interesting interview, because there's so much of that that's just different to anything you've ever thought about. It's
Absolutely. I mean, on storage flight, we used to have to do monthly ground runs, you know, just to keep them ticking over. And every now and again, you'd have to do something on top of the wing, and God forbid you ever dropped anything, because the wing would have to come off to get underneath the engine to fish it out. Because underneath you'd have access panels, but you can guarantee if you dropped a nut from the top that it would be nowhere near an access panel, so it'd be wing off, engine out. You wouldn't be very popular.
good lord, I have a bad enough time in my engine bay dropping bits. I couldn't imagine that. God, you've got to be really careful about dropping stuff, haven't you, doing your job?
Yeah, people used to, I mean, there's novel things, you know, you'd have a spanner, but you'd tie a piece of string around the spanner and the other end around your wrist. So if you did let go of the spanner, you know, you could always hoist it back out.
Roger. One thing in interest that I've heard about a lot from maintenance crews is that, kind of from my perspective, it looks really a really cool romantic job working on these things. But in reality, like you said earlier, it must just become a job, and you know, a job's a job, and you prefer the easier job, so you can go home and get a cup of tea, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose you do. I think what some people do, I mean, some jets are better than others, and I think the Tornado is particularly quite good, actually, especially for a Sooty, because it's designed to be, service units to be changed quickly. So they tend to be accessible, and they tend to be fairly straightforward. You know, you get the odd weird things like APUs are just a nightmare, and drive generators and things like that can be a bit of a pain, but in general, they're quite easy. So I look at a garage mechanic and look at my own engine and go, oh my God, what a nightmare. Whereas he thinks about it the same way, you know, that, oh, it's very easy.
Yeah, no, it's fair. It's all perspective, I guess. Right, question 9. Can you explain some of the changes made to the engines in the F2/3 compared to those in the GR and the ground rolls? I've always found it interesting how ground rolled Tornadoes have small engines despite being built for low level. I assumed that high bypass engines needed a physically bigger fan. For example, RAF/Royal Navy Phantoms had a wider fuselage to accommodate the Spey as opposed to the original J79. What an interesting question.
Yeah, very interesting. I think there's 2 or 3 bits that I need to pull out of that, really. I think the difference between the 103 and the 104, as I said earlier, is mainly the longer jet pipe. And I actually had to have a quick look on Wikipedia just about the thrust. And generally, dry thrust is fairly equal. It's only when you get into reheated thrust or afterburner that it's more. I think that's probably where the extended jet pipe comes into effect. So that's the main difference, and the operating system wouldn't matter too much, MECU and DECU wise. The next bit, let me have a quick look. So high bypass, it didn't have a high bypass. It was really quite small. It's like 1.1 to 1 or something. So in essence, it's a turbojet with quite a small bypass. So that's that bit. The Phantom, I think, again, we're back to politics. I think part of the reason they bought the Phantom is because they could then get Rolls-Royce to fit an engine into it and create jobs in the UK. So I'm happy to argue the pros and cons of that, or be proven wrong. But I don't know. I just think it was probably just to try and get to offset the fact we were buying American, that we'd fit it with Rolls-Royce engines.
Roger. I'm just looking at one of the, I think this is one of the GR engines here, one of the RB199s. I'm looking at the front, so it's staring into the main compressor. Below that is what looks like a big drive shaft coming out and forwards of the engine. Below it, Any idea what that is? Is that going off to drive something like a big generator or something?
Oh, no, that's the power takeoff shaft. So that comes. So just in front of the intake, you'd have the bulkhead that goes into the SPS bay or the secondary power system bay. That is the interface between the engine gearbox and the gearboxes within the SPS bay. So to start an engine, what you would do is start the APU. The APU would then drive the gearbox that's attached to the aircraft, not the engine. The gearbox would then induce rotation within a fluid clutch, which would then spin that power takeoff shaft, which would spin the gearbox on the engine, and through a drive would then spin, I think it was the HP compressor, which would then get the whole engine up and running.
So what I heard from that especially is that there's a lot of parts of the power plant that are actually attached to the plane, and rather than the engine per se. Is that normal?
Generally, I mean, so if you imagine you're looking down on a tornado, just in front of where the engines are, you had a bay that went across the whole width of the aircraft, and you'd have the APU on the right-hand side of the aircraft that was attached to the right-hand gearbox. That gearbox could then independently drive the left gearbox as well. So from the APU on the right side, you could start either the left or right engine. Plus, if you lost an engine, you could also still have the two gearbox because it was independent. So you'd have two generators, you'd have two hide pumps, two fuel pumps, etc. So,
Roger. Just looking at pictures of the engine bay, but okay, right, okay, very good. Right, that's that question answered as best we can. Next, what was the relationship like between pilots and ground crew on the Tornado squadrons? We often hear about pilots in other air forces sometimes increasing the workload for the ground crew by pulling too many Gs, overspeeding the landing gear, and not admitting it when they see the ground crew. Did this extend to engines, or was it only a problem for other ground crew?
Personally, I thought the relationship was really good. Mainly probably because I started on the squadron at 99 just as we started operations in Kosovo. And there's nothing that binds people together, especially aircrew and ground crew, is when they're in action and likely to get shot at, and they're relying on you to make sure that whatever they're in is safe. So there was mutual respect there. There was always that hierarchy, which I think you needed just within the military anyway. You need some sort of structure. Every now and again, it could be a bit condescending, and if you had anyone in particular that was particularly, trying not to swear, particularly nasty or anything like that, then it was quite simple for us to prevent them from ever flying again, really, just by pulling the odd circuit breaker. There was little tricks that we knew that would stop them doing anything. But in general, I think they respected our efforts and our diligence and our skill, and we certainly respected them for what they did. So yeah, good.
Awesome. Okay. Next, as you have deployed many times, can you give some insight as to the logistical effort needed to deploy even just a 4-ship of fast jet? How often were things like spare parts, fuel, tyres, weapons, food and medicine being flown out to you?
I'd absolutely be speculating for the majority of this, because we had some great, a trade in itself, the supply trade, worked around the clock, constantly shipping things in and out. There's very little that we had to deal with ourselves apart from just get on with doing our job. I think the UK, as opposed to some other nations, some of the bigger ones like the US, there's very much an emphasis that we work with the host nation. So we rely on them for fuel, food, things like that. So, for example, when Gulf War II started, we went to Al Udeid in Oman, and when we got there, it was quite heavily populated by the Americans, which is great. The Brits always love that because there'll be a Baskin Robbins or a pizza place or whatever, which we never had. But we just used to beg, borrow, and steal off them. So nothing aircraft-wise, but things like wood, to build shelters or to build gazebos and things like that. And they'd think our stuff was interesting, although we thought it was terrible. So it's surprising what you can get for just a moth-eaten beret, an RAF beret. You'd end up with torches and Gerbers and everything. What they valued was bizarre, really. But we never really ran out of everything. Stuff always turned up.
Roger, very good. Next, was it ever possible to cannibalise parts from GR tornadoes to be used in an F3? Was there a large degree of commonality between tornadoes operated by different countries? If so, did the fact that the Saudis used tornadoes ever benefit you when you were deployed to the Middle East?
Short answer is probably no. I don't think we ever benefited from any Saudi parts. I remember once I got sent out to Naples because one of our jets wouldn't start, and the Italians gave us an igniter that I managed to fit in there. Basically, it's down to NATO stock numbers, so you might have commonality in parts between the F3 and GR4 that we just didn't know about. The NATO number might be the same. It might be produced on the same machine to the same spec, and you just put the NATO number in when you're ordering it, and it turns up. So we probably wouldn't know, but we certainly wouldn't go across to an F3 squadron and ask to borrow something. We'd order it through supply.
Yeah, we asked pretty much the same question to a Eurofighter engineer a couple of weeks ago, and he said essentially the same thing. It's not like a kind of like, with a car, you can order a Nissan part from one Nissan to go and fit in another. It's highly regulated, kind of like you're getting at. You given a number, you order that number, and that's it. It's all like you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And the individual part that comes would probably have its own serial number as well, which have to be logged against that particular aircraft. So it's unlikely you would rob something off one aircraft to put to the other unless you absolutely needed to. I mean, that's not to say that within a squadron, if you're allocated 12 jets, 2 would probably be away on major servicing or deep strip, and 1 would be, we used to call it the Christmas tree. So that's the one that you rob when you're waiting for spares to come in, hoping that you'd get round to actually completing that one wonder.
Cool, very good. Again, we hear exactly the same thing from other ground guys. Okay, 13. From what I can tell, the RAF had built up a good reputation at Red Flag for consistently embarrassing the technologically superior USAF with nothing more than a few Buccaneers and GR1s. Did this reputation extend to way USAF ground crew looked at RAF aircraft, or was this dismissed as just another foreign aircraft? Yeah,
again, I think this is sort of 50% of this answer would be best coming from the crew, but it depends what you class as technologically superior. I think we always think of radars and things like that as being, a measure of how superior something is. But you look at a Buccaneer or a Tornado, there's very little that can catch that so low level at the speed that they go when you're purely designed as a fighter. I mean, probably more so now with the loop-down radars and things, but for what they were designed to do, they were superb at it, absolutely superb. With regards to ground crew, we tended not to mix too much on operations with the Americans, and that's not because we didn't want to. It's just we tended to be separate. Every interaction we had with them, it was always friendly, respectful. They were slightly different from culture-wise, not too different, but yeah, absolutely fine, great guys. And like I said before, they'd swap things or give you things at the drop of a hat. I suppose the country that I'd align with more, just from experience, would be the Aussies in Gulf War II, because they were right next to us operating F-18s. And some of the banter that we got up to was absolutely obscene, putting models of the Queen up naked. They were, we were slagging their cricket off, and just really good guys. But in general, we all had a job to do, and we got on really well. and we'd do anything for each other. So yeah.
Very good. What, in your opinion, was the most tedious/frustrating aspect of working on the Tornado? Were there ever any jobs you just hated doing?
Yeah, I put 2 or 3 examples down. So APU changes were a bit of a pain because on first glance you'd look at it and think, well, it's dead accessible. You open a panel, it's right in front of you. But just little faffy things that you had to move out of the way. And sometimes you'd have to take the whole APU out just to get to igniter. So little design things on that was a pain in the backside. Boroscoping engines took a while, and you sort of get disheartened because very rarely did you find anything wrong anyway. And that was one of the fears sometimes as a supervisor, that people would just sign them off without doing them. So I don't know, that was always a worry. And you tended to, in the early days, if a fairy or a plumber, which is an armourer, were doing, or a rigger, were doing things on jets, they tended to want to do ground runs afterwards just to operate the system. So you'd end up hanging around for hours and hours and hours till 4 or 5 in the morning to do literally just start the engine up for them, which was a bit of a pain.
Oh, John. Okay. The borescopes, are they literally just the optical type borescopes?
Yeah, absolutely. So you would there's access holes within the engine for different stages of the engine. And then there's another access hole where you would put a tool in that would rotate the blade, so you could look at each blade in particular, or you could look at like nozzle guide vanes or things like that.
Interesting. Okay. Right. 15. How does the depth and breadth of the British Armed Forces aeronautical engineering training compare with other Western nations?
Again, without knowing other Western what they do, it's a difficult one to ask, to answer. So all I can say from my experience is that mechanics in the early 90s, late 80s, you left with the city and guilds in aeronautical engineering. And a lot of that was your basics, your hand tools and things like that. And then you get an overview of gas turbine theory if you were a Sooty, for example. The technician's course was much more in depth, and that was an ONC in aeronautical engineering. And that caught quite a few decent guys out who were very good with their hands and knew a lot about the particular aircraft they were working on, but struggled a little bit with the physics or the maths of it. But yeah, it was hard, but it was good. Engineering officers tended to have a HNC or a degree. I think what they tried to do in the 80s was to introduce civilian licenses, on some of the larger aircraft engineers. But I think what they found was that they put all these guys through the licenses, and then they PVR'd, left the RAF, and ended up on 3-4 times more an hour than they were on inside. So they soon knocked that on the head.
Right. Yeah. What are the career prospects of someone leaving the forces with similar qualifications and experience? Is there a decent career path from military to civilian?
That's a great question, isn't it? I think it's less about the qualification. The qualification helps, and I think you can transfer that to many fields. I think what matters more is what being in the Air Force or being in the military in general gives you. I mean, your attitude, your resilience. I think that's what's attractive to companies. And I think that there's nothing that increases your resilience more than being in a 72-man tent, with that shared misery. To get on with other people and to just get your head down and do it. It just instills a coping mechanism, doesn't it? Absolutely. And that's a difficult thing to say because that's only my experience. I mean, the other side of it is being a nurse. You come across sort of Army, Marines, and people who've been really severely injured, and it's difficult then to say that my resilience comes off bad times or off shared misery when you see what they've gone through. So I really feel for those people, and I think I worry more about those guys and girls than I worry about ex-engineers who've just spent a really crappy time in the desert. if you know what I mean.
Andrew. Okay. Question 17. I understand that a derivative of the RB199 Mark 104 from the F3 Tornado eventually became the EJ2000, which I think is the engine in the Eurofighter, which went on to power the best frontline fighter in the world. Yes, I must be right. Yes, I am extremely biased. Considering how well the EJ2000 performs, even by modern standards, did the Mark 104 design stand out as particularly advanced?
Yeah, I didn't really know. I mean, I knew that the 199 was fitted in, I think it was the EAP, was it called? The experimental,
I didn't know that.
The run into the Eurofighter. And I presume that was just because it was an engine that we had that was fairly powerful, that would fit, really. I'm not sure that the 199-104 ended up being the EJ200, I think it is. So I don't really know. I think the difference is you've got quite a powerful engine in a smaller aircraft that's lighter. So that probably had more to do with it. But the EJ200 is an outstanding engine, power to weight ratio wise compared to the Tornado anyway. So
yeah, really, really is impressive. The EJ, although it's not that powerful, I think I haven't really practiced this, but I think it's less powerful than a legacy Hornet engine. But the whole airframe in total is so light that it's got a mad power to weight ratio, and you know that as soon as you go and see an air show and compare it to other things, it just really is quite an amazing bird. Also, the sound it makes. The only thing it sounds like to me is a Legacy Hornet or a Super Hornet. It doesn't sound like anything else with a slightly bigger engine. They're really loud, these things.
Yeah, it does sound. I think what annoyed me about the Tornadoes from the front, it was like a high pitched squeal. It was awful. If you got really close to it, an engine runs. But around the back, when you stuck it into reheat, that's when it was great. It was impressive.
Yeah, amazing engine. Okay, that's that. So that's the EJ200. We're getting mixed up with the EF2000, aren't we? Right. My family was in Bruggen. I used to watch the planes take off, the Lightnings. Oh, yes. F4, yes. What squadrons were there? And was it still a QRF station? This is from Mad Dogs.
Brilliant. So, what squadrons were there? So, when I was there, as you came through the camp, you had the runway, and around the runway were 4 squadrons in hardened aircraft shelters. So, if we do it clockwise, the first one you'd come to would be 17 Squadron. You'd then come across 17. I think then it was 9, then it was 14, then it was 31. Were they QRF was the next bit? Yeah. Well, yes and no. So they weren't fighters, so quick reaction fighters. However, up until we left, I think, well, we there was obviously a nuclear dump there as well. So we would do tachyval exercises and things where we'd load nuclear weapons. So technically, I suppose it was a quick reaction to something going off, but by that time, it was very unlikely that it was ever going to happen. So no QRF in a fighter sense, again, mainly because you're surrounded by US air bases that have got more than enough to sort that out. But possibly from a strike point of view, yeah.
So what did they have at Bruggen? They had the Tornadoes, they had the Jags.
Well, I mean, there'd be very little crossover. So it was all Tornadoes or all Jags. So as squadrons phased out the Jags, they would then replace them with the Tornadoes.
Roger.
There was also Phantoms there at one point.
Yeah, I just saw a Phantom picture. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, very good. We're getting on. Where are we now? Was maintenance carried out with more urgency for aircraft on QRA compared to others, as I would assume that any small issues would have been dealt with immediately rather than deferred? So were you working with QRA situations? I guess you were, weren't you?
Yeah, definitely in the Falklands. So in the Falklands, you had 4 F3s when I was there. And they were called Faith, Hope, Charity, and the last one was Desperation. And so you'd have, I think it was about 10 aircraft shelters, but we had 4 aircraft there. 2 were always on QRA, and you'd always have the ground crew and the air crew that were stationed in between the 2 hangars, and they didn't leave there for the period that they were on QRA. What you would tend to do is you would tend to use the best aircraft on QRA, and if you saw something that was going to be a problem, you would swap it with another aircraft rather than doing the work while the aircraft was on QRA, if that makes sense. So rather than do a job in the QRA hangar, you would literally swap jets for one that was operational and do the work on that in the different hangar.
Where were you based at this time exactly?
Falkland, so that'd be RAF Mount Pleasant.
It doesn't mean anything to me. Right, I'm gonna have to go and have a look at that now. I'm just learning properly about the Falklands now. But RAF Mount Pleasant. RAF. I'm going to have to interview about this as well, but we're not quite ready for that. Mount Pleasant. Royal Air Force of the Falkland Islands. So is this actually on the island? Where are we in the world now?
Yeah, it's about, I think it was about 20, 30 miles just to the west of Stanley.
Yep. Okay, so we've got it there. Right, how interesting. Oh, I can't wait to hear about all this and all your stories. Okay. I'd love to quiz you further on this, but I think we'll wait maybe until we get more into the Falklands. But it's awesome to see that we've got a serviceman from there who'd be willing to talk to us. Hopefully, that would be cool. Back to the viewer's question. There was a kind of second part. Was it ever possible to tell when an engine was being used for QRA due to increased wear and tear?
Yeah, not just the engines either. The aircraft. So most aircraft have. I suppose the telltale boxes. So they'd have a box in there that one of the engineers, when it landed, would make a note of how many times a certain G level was pulled. That would then go into the computer, and it would knock off so many flight hours or so many cycles from that particular aircraft. So there was very little the aircrew could get away with. It's not as if they could pull 12G, come back, and then just whistle away into the crew room. You know about it. Engine-wise, engines were different really because they were limited on turbine blade temperature. So you really couldn't exceed that because that was set. Apart from, you would have we used to call it the war and peace switch. So there's little bit of copper telltale wire that if you switch that would take you above and beyond the limit for that. So you definitely know if that was tripped. But in general, they looked after the jets. It was in their interest. The aircrew were really quite good.
Roger. Next question, a bit of a weird one. Where does militaries get their wives? Asking in dimension of because they are all in a man's collective. That's from Iquim. Where do militaries get their wives? It's an interesting question. It's an odd thing to ask. But if you're, in that lifestyle, how does that happen?
Yeah. I suppose. I suppose a better question is where do military people get their wives that stay with them?
That's more important.
I think lots of young lads tend to get off with local girls who probably see it as a bit of excitement, and it tends not to last too much. I mean, there are obviously exceptions to that. A lot of lads I knew actually ended up marrying people that from where they were from rather than from where they were posted. So they go back home on leave and they'd end up with people there. But just regular places, wherever. Tended to be nightclubs and discos that were close to RAF camps, I suppose.
Roger. I'm surrounded by some USAF bases, Mildenhall, Alconbury, well, it's gone now, I think, Lakenheath. And a lot of those, over the decades, a lot of those Americans have married here and settled in Norfolk, as we call it, which is the It's the county where we are. Sorry, I don't know why I said that. Obviously, you know that. And there's a lot of Yanks if you go to Norfolk that are settled, obviously retired and settled there. So
How do you compete with an American in Britain?
you don't. They turn up with their big V8s and they're like, "Hey, baby," and we're like, "Man, nerdy Brits." But anyway, so the Yanks they control Norfolk. But there you go. Very good. That's that. How do you feel about computer software class flight simulators? Use it as a hobby or any else? You're gonna have to figure that one out, I'm afraid, Shady.
So I think like most lads, I think were interested in it for years. I can remember in the 90s playing. I don't know if you remember the Tornado one. You know, the graphics were awful, but loved it. Absolutely loved it.
What was it called? What was it called? I don't.
I think it was called Tornado, wasn't it?
Tornado Sim PC game. I'll try. See what that comes up with. A Tornado gameplay. Wow, look at that. 1993. No, that bypassed me completely, and that does look horrendous, by the way. Even for 1993, that looks horrendous.
At the time, it was awesome. It was awesome.
I bet it was. You go back and look at Falcon 3 or whatever, though. Sorry, I might have said that wrong, but you know, the old Falcon. Wow, look at that.
I think roundabout that's when I got married, actually, in '93. So all that fun stopped. So I suppose then you've got that the family time when, well, especially back then, you're not earning a lot of money. The PCs were prohibitively expensive. There wasn't great games out, so sort of dropped it for a while. And then it's only as I sort of reached my 30s again, I started to see the improvements. And yeah, it's a great hobby. It's great escapism, if nothing else, especially in VR. You know, it's just a way of sorting your mental health out a little bit and just resetting yourself. I think it's just a great thing. And also joining a group with like-minded people who are generally really nice guys.
Yeah, I get a lot of flack for calling it a game because people have some weird thing that they must call it a simulator, otherwise, you know, it doesn't validate their lives. But it is. It's like I always say, apart from me, for 99.99% of you, it's really something for you guys to come home to and just get away from it. You know, just reset your brain, have a bit of fun. That's what it's there for, and it does it very well, as I'm sure other games do as well. Interesting here, it says Amiga. Do you remember that? There was a PC and Amiga. My friend Wilson had the Amiga. I had the PC, and we would always argue about which is better. God, those were the days, weren't they?
I think this was on the Amiga that I had at the time, yeah.
MS-DOS and Amiga, yeah. How about that? God, how times have changed. Right, that's that. Is that our last question? It is our last question, Shady. I really enjoyed that, and I learned a lot as well. That's not to say because I didn't actually know hardly anything about the Tornado. I always hated the Tornado until as soon as it retired, and then I loved it, which is unfortunately just how it works for me. As soon as something's retired, I immediately love it and want it back. Same with cars.
I suppose the further you get away from it, I haven't worked on it for 15 years now, you become, I don't know, it's like an old girlfriend, isn't it? 15 years down the line, she isn't as bad as you thought she was. You start to sort of reminisce about things. So, yeah, I mean, it's a shame, but, you know, life goes on.
Roger. Well, now it's become cool and retro. I'm starting to learn about it. Like I said, my books have just arrived, and I'm going to start researching it. Shady, it was lovely speaking to you. Anything you missed, anything you want to speak about or whatever before we sign off?
Not in particular, no. I mean, if anyone's got any further questions, happy to answer it via, message or whatever. But thanks very much.
Thanks very much. And if you're interested, like I said, in a couple of months' time, I'd love to cover the Falklands campaign. I'd love to get your view on that and maybe some sound bites from you on that, of your time up there. That'd be really interesting to cover.
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, mate. And I will speak to you in due course.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.